So what's the co-evolution of language and culture? What does that particularly mean? Um, of course, we're interested, psychology is interested in the evolution of things, the beginnings of things, how they emerge, how they have changed over time, how they may collide in terms of who we are. And from an evolutionary point of view, we know that us, if we take it from the evolutionary theoretical perspective, we talk about higher animals with cognitive functioning, aka prefrontal cortex, frontal lobes that allow us to think and organize and plan, language acquisition devices, which um, Noam Chomsky said, we are humans are biologically programmed to speak a language, even if they can't hear the language or verbally speak the language, they still have that universality of the production of language. And with all that said, you know, language is something that connects people culturally. It connects us universally. Um, it helps us communicate with one another. And language comes in all forms. I was recently talking to a very good friend of mine that I went to college with, and she's planning to retire this year. And she said in her retirement, she wants to get back to learning, improving her American Sign Language, and that she wants to work on her American Sign Language. And sometimes we forget about sign languages as being part of the cultural language set as well. Um, we talk about how language allows us to communicate who we are, our reactions, our belief systems. Um, if we really didn't have this ability, this language ability, this communication ability, how would we survive? What would the cultures look like? And I think if we take it from that evolutionary point of viewpoint, and we see the growth and development of societies across the planet, we can see how that language is important. There is a whole field in linguistics that talks about preserving lost languages, or languages that are in jeopardy of being lost. And how do we preserve those? And that preserving of that language also preserves the culture that that language exists in. Oftentimes we think of kind of the big 10 languages or big 5 languages. There's many other kind of dialects that occur within language sets. I think one of the two prolific examples is India, and how India's language makeup is across the country and the continent of Africa, and even countries within Africa, where you have variations of dialects and even different languages. I think in Ghana, there's like 3 major um, languages spoken, and I think they all are part of the national language along with English. And it is divided by areas in the country, and some of it is divided by even um, cultural practices as well. So each culture has its unique language, but the one thing that we do know is when children are born, they're perfect universal linguists. They can attune and hear every spoken language on the planet. But what happens is they start attuning and pruning to and neurogenesing to the language that is constantly spoken to them in their culture. This is why some of us who don't have that polyglot ability to pick up languages and sound like a native speaker, is that we sound like we are speaking in our native tongue, but we're speaking the language that we are speaking. Say, so you're speaking Spanish, but you have an American accent, often they'll say, or you're speaking French, but you have an Americanized accent. Okay, because of the English, American English versus British English, Australia English, that individuals may be speaking. So language allows us to take pride in who we are, and take pride in relationship to our culture, and reinforce the culture in reality. This is why it's so very important not to have the loss of those languages as well. So the structures of language, I always make the joke that I was never hooked on phonics. So when I was in elementary school, and that's why I have a difficult time pronouncing certain words and pronunciation, and I mispronounce words, is because I was never hooked on phonics. Sometimes I think it may be even be in a learning disability, because I'm in the age group that learning disabilities weren't really found out. We didn't have really testing and protocols around learning disabilities, and that has evolved over the years, and now we have a lot of information about learning disabilities. And learning disabilities, not saying that you have the inability to learn. We know it just makes learning a little bit difficult in certain realms of kind of academic educational um, pursuits. So we have the lexicon, the syntax in the grammar, the phonology, which is hooked on phonics, the semantics, and the pragmatics of language. And every language on the planet has this structure feature in terms of the spoken words that we get and which we understand. Sometimes, if you notice, it's like tomato or tomato, kind of will say. Um, I I most recently, what I really like is vitamin versus vitamin, because I guess the British English is vitamin, and out, everything outside the Queen quote the Queen's English is vitamin. Uh, Herbs versus herbs, depending on kind of um, this kind of phonology, kind of the lexicon of language. Um, I know personally, kind of learning a language, especially, and sometimes this is the downfall of us learning a language, is that we get hung up on syntax and grammar. And a lot of formal education starts with grammar versus conversation. And if you've ever been somewhere, conversation, if you've been somewhere where you don't speak the language, conversation is really the key of becoming proficient in a language, is having that experience to conversate and to speak the language. A lot of times when we're learning a language, we are very reluctant to speak it because we don't want to make mistakes or offend people, or you know uh, make ourselves look foolish. But that's the worst thing we can do when we're talking about a particular language acquisition, is that we must be able to speak it. We must have it in the context of how the language is used and created. And I'm probably one of the best examples of that, because your instructor speaks no language fluently, um, and barely can speak English. And I have traveled everywhere, and I would travel to France every year for 13 years straight. Every year I would go to France and spend a significant time there. Would spend, sometimes summers, and sometimes, most times, it would be the whole Christmas season, from December, from Thanksgiving to the beginning of New Year's. I would spend there, because I worked at a college that we got our winter break started right after Thanksgiving. I wish we had that, and then it's picked back up right after New Year's. So I studied French. I've taken French conversational classes, French one, a little bit of two, and I recognize French when I hear it. I kind of understand some of it, but my actual French speaking abilities aren't that great. And I spent a lot of time in Paris. Paris is like New York City, or what New York City used to be. It's like the epicenter of France, and it's city. You know, city people are different from country folks, you know, or rural folks. So there, you always get a little bit of, um, you know, stuffiness of what city life is about. So I remember in Paris, there are lots of stores that are specific to a particular item. Like there's a boulangerie, which is for bread. You have the fishmonger, the meat monger. I don't even know if it's called meat monger. Charcuterie. Um, you have a number of individual stores that you would go to. The vino store, you know, it wouldn't be necessarily going to the grocery store. Now there are supermarkets that exist where you can get one-stop shop, but in traditional French culture has been you go to neighborhood stores. So my friend lived in a neighborhood, and I would go to the bakery. And I felt comfortable enough because I had been coming years and years going to the bakery. And most people who own these stores are most people that worked in the stores worked it, that was their main job. It was not kind of not like here in the United States where, you know, people work several part-time jobs. Most of the times in France and in Europe in general, people like waiters is a profession. A person will work at one restaurant their whole entire life, versus we have a more transient viewpoint of our restaurant tourist industry. So I go into the boulangerie, and you always have to greet, which is something that we don't always do in America, but it's like mandatory in France, is that you must, once you enter a place or enter when people are around, you must greet based upon the time of day. So it's either morning, afternoon, or evening. So most times it's early morning because you want to go to the bread store early to get the best pieces of bread, and not for them to run out because they only make so much a day. So when you enter in, you say bonjour, and the person would bonjour back to you, and then you would proceed to ask what you want, or ask questions, or pick out your breads. And this would always give me the opportunity to practice. And they would politely correct me if I was incorrect, but they would always give me accolades for trying. Because I think when you try to speak a language in a place where you don't where English is not spoken, or your native tongue is not spoken, most people, not all, most people will appreciate the effort. I don't know how many of you all have seen I don't know if it's Netflix, it might be Netflix or Prime, but it's called Emily in Paris. And she's this young woman that gets transferred to a job in Paris, and she does like everything that you would not do as a person coming into a business and communicating in only in English, and bringing your ethnocentric viewpoint of how people should communicate and how things are communicated. If you haven't watched it, you can catch French people talking about it, and language people talking about it on YouTube. But it's a perfect example of this idea of the robustness and the idea behind language and the importance of language. So we have our phonemes, which are the smallest basic units of language. They form the basis of all language building upon. The morphemes are the smallest units of the meaning of language. So we have the sound, intonations of language, and then we have the meaning of language. Each culture has some complexity of sound, phonemes, and morphemes in terms of that language being spoken. I think of Xhosa, which is a language spoken in South Africa that has clicks to it. There's certain number of clicks in Xhosa that you include when you're speaking the language. And if you're a non-Xhosa speaker, it is very difficult to learn how to do those clicks in the language. I think if you're a fan of the Marvel movies, in the movie Black Panther, they some of the one of the tribes spoke a Xhosa, language where you could hear the clicking of the language. When we talk about culture and language acquisitions, humans, we're human, we have the ability to acquire language. We are biologically programmed to acquire the language, whether or not if we can hear or see the language that is being spoken to us. Remember, I said infants have the whole range of sound production and are universalists when they get here, but then they start pinpointing and getting reinforcement to the language that is spoken to their native tongue, the native language that is spoken to them, and the interactions within that society and that culture they have around that language. Our culture provides us with phonology, syntax, grammar, semantics, and pragmatics. If you think of languages like Pidgin, for instance, or Ebonics, or Patois that we hear in the Caribbean, they all have rules, phonology, syntax, grammar, and semantics and pragmatics. And they have been recognized in most cases as actual languages and not a bastardized form of a language. They are languages with these rules that designate what language is. So there's a reciprocal relationship between our language and our culture. They are not, they cannot be separated. They influence one another. And I can truly kind of testify to that. And if you've lived it, embedded in a culture of your family home or ancestral home, or even your family that you go home to is embedded in a complete different culture, and you speak a language other than English in your household, you know how much of that is important to you understanding who you are culturally. And if that is taken away from you, how much impact that can have. We have that historically across the world where people have been, their culture and language has been stripped or denied or put impediments in front of them for it not to be the interaction. And this is why we know how important the reciprocal nature of language and culture is. So language differences across culture. Think about um, the formal speaking of language. And I know Japanese has a formal level of speaking. I'm assuming, I may be assuming wrong. Somebody put in the chat, this Chinese, Cantonese, and Mandarin have a formal, informal way of speaking. If you can think about English, I wouldn't necessarily, to an elder, someone who is older than me, call them by their first name. I would give them their title, Miss or Mrs. or Doctor. I wouldn't say to someone who is 70 years old, hey, Junie, or hey, Tom. When I'm a younger person, I would say maybe Mr. Tom or Miss Junie. So the context of honorific speech, honoring those interactions that define kind of status within the culture. Um, Also, when we talk about how people refer to themselves, I have a very good friend, Asuko, who I always refer to as Asuko-san. And I know sometimes when people are your friends, you may use a different ending than san. I think, what is it? Ren, help me out here. It starts with a C. Cha? Chain?
Ciao.
What's it called?
Ciao.
Yes, there you go. See, I can't even pronounce it. So, all these things are based upon your relationships that you have with people embedded in the culture, whether the culture has this formal way of operating in society. This is where we get into the high context versus low context cultures. Those cultures that are that like to be those cultures that have the honorific titles, the differentiation of status within the culture versus cultures that are the titles are not necessarily that important in terms of communication. as well. So let me check the time. All right, I'm right at the time. So Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is speakers of different languages think differently because of their differences in their languages. So this is this was kind of investigated through um, um, the Spear-Whorf hypothesis, and they came up with this idea that this may be true. But researchers looking at is this true or not true? Do we actually look? Do we think differently because our languages are different? And what they have done is they looked at colors and how colors are interpreted in the language and described within the language. I think we do know there are some variations. I think the Inuit, the First Nation people of Alaska and northern Canada, have um, different languages or different words for snow. Snow can mean various different things. It's just not one word for snow. And I'm sure there are other languages, if you can think of some other languages that you know that have words that expand beyond just one meaning, and not based upon intonations either, but one word, but it can have multiple meanings depending on what the how the word is used, or what how the I guess you could do intonations or how the word is pronounced. I think that's why some Southeast Asian languages are more difficult to learn because they're tonal, like Vietnamese and Thai have a lot of tonal representation in terms of, and I know Chinese does too, forms of Chinese does as well, is that if you are saying in terms of raising or lowering, this is why where the accents fall tells you if you raise or lower or have even intonations, and when you speak, depending on what the accents say, can mean on the word could produce a different sound and a different meaning for the word, even if the word is possibly spelled the same but have different accents. Okay, so this is one reason why I'm obsessed, really, and fascinated with the polyglots, and have become even more fascinated with polyglots. I had a former uh, colleague who was a polyglot, and pretty amazing gentleman, and was constantly learning languages, and learning languages through conversation, doing some formal studying, but really practicing and learning the language through conversation. And that is just so very important, that you have to stretch yourself to speak the language, and to take the leap to really express yourself in that language.